And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to continue working with our aggregate expenditure model. And we are now going to connect it to these two formulas that I've had up top here on all these videos. And I haven't really referenced them. I haven't referenced them at all. And we are now going to do so. So we're going to connect all of this together now. The marginal propensity to consume, the idea of the multiplier effect, and our graph. So let's start with a real-world event. Let's say that our real-world event is that we get a government stimulus package. So we've talked about that before. We did an example with that on an earlier video. We get a government stimulus package. So for whatever reason, the government's going to spend more money, and that's going to cause an increase in government spending, and that's going to cause an increase in aggregate expenditures, and that's going to cause the aggregate expenditure curve to shift up. This is all stuff that we've talked about before, so that's, excuse me for going here a little fast. And that's going to cause spending to be greater than production. That's going to cause inventories to begin to decline. Companies will respond by increasing production until we get to our new equilibrium level of Y2. So then we would say here my determinant was a change in government spending. It was an increase in aggregate expenditure curves. The curve shifted up, and that causes an increase in gross domestic product. So that's all great. That's stuff that we've talked about before. But we now want to add to this is we want to add some numbers. We want to add the magnitude of these changes. We want to add the magnitude of these changes. So to do that, let's think about it this way. The change in the gross domestic product is equal to any change in initial spending times what we call the multiplier effect. So we get some initial increase in spending of some amount of money, and that could come because the government it could be any real-world event or determinant that shifts the curve. In my example, this change in initial spending was because the government started spending more money. It could be because the stock market goes up and that increases wealth and people begin consuming more. It could be because your exchange rates changed and that caused a change in net exports. It could be because the government cut taxes or raised taxes or people save more, or any of the determinants that we've talked about that cause this aggregate expenditure curve to shift is what we call the change in initial spending. Okay, so the change in initial spending is right here. This is this distance between the shift in the aggregate expenditure curve. In this case, it shifted up. That is called the change. That's what I'm calling the change in initial spending. Okay, so this right here is the change in initial spending. And let's say that the change in initial spending in this example, the government stimulus package, let's put a number on it. Let's say that the government spent an additional $100 million. So we're going to put $100 million right here. The government spent $100 million. Now, that when the government does that, when they spend that $100 million, that's going to have some multiplier effect, which we did talk about on a previous video. But let's just remind ourselves what that would mean. That would mean this. So let's say, remember, y is equal to c plus I plus g plus nx. So if you get an increase in government spending of $100 million, that's going to increase gross domestic product by $100 million by definition, because when the government spends that money, it's going to become somebody's income. And now that those people are going to have hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're going to, part of that money they're going to go spend. How much of that money are they going to go spend? Well, it depends on what the marginal propensity to consume is. Let's say that the marginal propensity to consume is calculated to be 0.75. So that means of any new $1 in income, 75 cents of it is going to get spent. So if the government spends $100 million, that causes GDP or income to go up by $100 million, and that's going to cause then consumption to go up by $75 million. And then, of course, that's going to mean $75 million more of income for somebody, and that'll cause consumption to go up by some new amount, 75% of that, and on it goes. We did this before on a previous video. How big is that multiplier effect? Well, the multiplier effect is 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC. Here's my MPC, is the marginal propensity to consume. So it's going to be 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75, and that would give us a multiplier of 4. So that multiplier of 4, that now gets plugged in down here. So the multiplier, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, then the multiplier would down here be 4. And so that multiplier idea, that's happening on the graph, moving along the aggregate expenditure curve. That's the way that I want to think about it. It's going to be moving along the aggregate expenditure curve. That's how I'm going to think about the multiplier effect, right? Because here's the initial change in government spending, and then that causes the increase in income, and then the increase in income causes the increase in consumption, which causes the increase in income, which causes, and off it goes, moving along the aggregate expenditure curve. We're moving along the aggregate expenditure curve here. And then what's going to be the final result of that? Well, you take that $100 million of more spending times the multiplier effect, and that's going to give you the change in gross domestic product of $400 million, which you find right here. This is the change in Y. This is the change in Y. So to put the numbers on it, right here we had a change in initial spending of $100 million, and that will cause in the end an increase in gross domestic product of $400 million. So you would be expected to take the marginal propensity to consume, plug that into the multiplier, take the change in initial spending times the multiplier, and that would tell you how much gross domestic product will go up in response to, in this case, the stimulus package. Now, we could do this all going the other way. So let's do this going the other way. So let's say this. Let's say that, let me back that up just for a second. So the other thing that I want to add to this is that we haven't talked about before is that this gross domestic product is associated with some level of unemployment. There's some level of unemployment, U1. And when the gross domestic product goes up and there's more production, that will cause the unemployment rate to go down. So U2 would be less than U1. Okay, when the gross domestic product goes up, there's an unemployment associated with that, but the unemployment is actually getting lower. The unemployment rate always moves in the opposite direction of the gross domestic product. So if you get an increase in the gross domestic product, that's going to cause a decrease in unemployment, because we're producing more, and so companies will have to hire more workers. The other way is if you get a decrease in the gross domestic product, if we would have gone the other way, then that would have actually caused unemployment to rise. That would have caused an increase in unemployment. So whenever we are graphing the gross domestic product, we just want to keep in mind we're also going on in the background is we're also looking at change in unemployment, which will always move in the opposite direction of the gross domestic product. It will always move in the opposite direction of the gross domestic product. All right, I was going to do a second part to this video, but it's getting a little long, so I'll do the second part of this idea on a second video. Thanks for joining me. Again, this has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast, and we'll see you on the next podcast.